Joining me on 12 Minutes With is the EU's counter-terrorism coordinator, Bart-Jan Vector. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Iran issued a global threat, warning that parks, recreational areas and tourist destinations worldwide will not be safe for what Tehran calls its enemies. How concerned are you regarding this situation and these threats?
Iran has been on our agenda for a while from a counterterrorism perspective. Why? Because Iran has consistently over the years targeted individuals in the EU, dissidents, and tried to disrupt our society, I would say. It's a lethal spoiler that's very well known to our services. In fact, the tactics deployed by Iran, I often say, are terrorist tactics. We've seen assassinations, we've seen, like I said, cyber attacks, targeting of individuals, and it instrumentalizes proxies as well, meaning it instrumentalizes criminal networks in the EU to carry out attacks so that it can then deny any link to its own regime. In fact, we've listed as terrorists the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, as well as the Security Service of Iran, and we've taken measures. But yes, in the current context, obviously, it's much more of a concern than ever.
Does that also simplify and help you to probably speed up the process of identification of those assets and those proxies that you
Definitely. I mean, and this is all about intelligence and information sharing among member states. That's where it comes down to. And in fact, if you look back at what the EU has done to counter the terrorist threats, let's say, in all their forms, whether it's malign state interference or the traditional sort of terrorist actors that we know, I think the core of our response has always been more information sharing, more common approaches, strengthening our borders, strengthening our databases, making sure that they're interoperable so that any information uploaded by one member state can be cross-checked with that of another member state. And so these are all measures that we have really put in place over the past 10 years. And by the way, I should say this has very much been driven by the European Commission that has put in place all these instruments and that are still working on many of these to strengthen our borders especially, but also to look within our the EU itself. You know, we've taken measures and stepped up. Some member states have stepped up those measures to protect Israeli sites, to protect Jewish sites as well, because very often it's now equated with Israel, unfortunately. We've seen a rise of anti-Semitism. So the kind of propaganda that is generated by a conflict that we're now seeing in the Middle East is it's very worrying, because this is spreading online and it's affecting the visions of some people.
I do want to ask you about Jewish communities in Europe. There's been an increase in the rise in the attacks ever since October 7 massacre. Do you foresee the situation worsening now with the US-Israel war on Iran?
I would say that in a situation as we're seeing now, where global tensions are rising especially in the Middle East, there will be reverberations on the international or the internal threat picture in the EU, meaning that also when it comes to Jewish sites or anti-Semitism, yes, we see an impact, and we have seen it for a while. Also, the conflict in Gaza at the time, now less of a headline perhaps, but that has very much generated the kind of narratives that influence some people and that radicalize some people, leading to anti-Semitism. By the way, also to anti-Islam. So we've seen a polarization throughout, I would say.
If Iran now becomes this state of revenge, what does that mean for Europe specifically? Because Europe is still at the same time not joining officially the United States, going into the war against Iran. But does that put Europe at the same threat level as the US, the way you see it? Or could that be worse should Europe join?
The threat has been there for a while, and the threat is escalating. Now, depending on how Europe will engage or not in that conflict, that of course will affect further the threat picture internally. But I don't deal, let's say, with the bigger picture. I really focus on, you know, how are the lives of people in the EU possibly affected.
What is your assessment over the threat coming from ISIS? Is that over or not yet?
Look, Islamic jihadism, let's say, remains the number one threat in Europe. Has always been, and that has not gone away over the years. We've seen some new threats that I'll be happy to say a few words about, but in terms of jihadism, that's the number one threat to our security. We've seen it coming from different regions. Central Asia is one, where we see a direct threat projection. But what's important to say, yes, we defeated the caliphate, or the so-called caliphate, 10 years ago. Ever since, what we've seen, and that is something that we're very closely monitoring, is that IS has adapted its tactics, and it's been very agile. First of all, it's decentralized its command centers, meaning that it has now different front lines, let's say, in the global war of jihad in different regions. But also, instead of organizing the sort of large-scale concerted attacks from outside the EU's borders, it has now shifted tactics to really trying to recruit people, very often young adolescents, from within the EU, which from their perspective is perhaps more effective. And we've seen there a trend of increased radicalization, especially of young people. And all this is happening in an online environment that very much still provides a lot of space for the kind of content that leads to radicalization.
When you say young people, what is the, if we can speak about the age range of the young people being radicalized?
I mean, we're talking about minors aged between 12 and 20 years old. I mean, we've seen cases of young individuals radicalizing who were as young as 12 years old. And the huge challenge for our law enforcement is that young people, young individuals radicalize very fast. Sometimes it's a matter of weeks. Some will have mental issues or will just be vulnerable, as adolescents are generally. But they will not have any track record, any criminal track record. They will not meet physically. Very often they spend most of their time online. So it's very difficult for our law enforcement to capture this. And again, it comes back to the same point. It's a matter of exchanging good practices, sharing data, sharing information, but also very much monitoring the online environment, which is where much of this takes place.
What are some of the, you mentioned earlier, the new threats? Mm-hmm. What are those new threats, if you could list some of them?
Yes. So what we've seen over the years is an increase, a rise in the kind of violent right-wing extremism, also to a degree violent left-wing extremism. But certainly we've seen that the violent right-wing extremism is very much creating communities online that lure young individuals into those networks and that then get into touch with all kinds of, some have called it salad bar terrorism, salad bar ideology, if you will, meaning that there are very often different parts of different ideologies that are put together in a sort of mismatch of very negative, very violent, let's say, motivations. And the new phenomenon as we see it is, and that's particularly worrying because this affects very young individuals, is what we call nihilistic extremist violence, which means that it's very often driven by an online community, which is very much violent extremist or accelerationists, meaning that they want to disrupt the whole of society. Racism is there, misogynism. And these young people are, they don't have any ideological baggage, which is why it's called nihilistic, but they're very much drawn to extreme violence. And the kind of extreme violence that we're talking about is very much also generated, to come back to your earlier question about Iran, by the kind of conflicts that we're seeing.
But that once again puts the youngest Europeans in utmost danger, once again, in terms of the age group.
As the use of the internet has dramatically increased, I mean, young people spend about 4.8 to 5 hours a day on social media, and some research has indicated that young people who spend between 5 and 8 hours a day on social media have a chance of mental health issues that's doubled. So we have to be concerned about the exposure to social media and to the internet, which is not to say that's all a negative thing, but it's a matter of educating youth, but it's also a matter of dialoguing with the platforms and the industry to ensure that, you know, they take their responsibility in countering the kind of content that is leading to radicalization of our young people.
And that is, of course, a huge debate globally and in Europe specifically regarding the access to some of the platforms for the younger Europeans. And with everything that you have been saying now about how much they are in danger and how much they could be radicalized as early as 12 years old and as quickly as within few weeks, that's an argument in that debate.
Definitely, and it raises the stakes. What I always say, and it's an important debate to have, because what we're often talking about, and we're all using those communications which are encrypted communications, which is very useful and very important because it protects our privacy, it protects us against cyber attacks and all of that. But there's also a downside, unless we organize it well. The downside at the moment is that our investigators, our law enforcement, does not have the access in the context of certain investigations to access those data and to explore the communication data between individuals, malign individuals, whether it's terrorists, people plotting attacks or whatever, often criminal networks, and that is a problem.
And the final question, 10 years since the Brussels attacks, with the commemorations taking place in Brussels over the weekend, do you feel Brussels, the EU, being safer now 10 years past that?
I would say I think we're in a much better place. And I say this also for two reasons. First of all, because I'm regularly speaking to law enforcement, the intelligence community, and they all share that assessment. That being said, we do face new threats, as you know. But we have also to be aware that even though we are in a better place today, and we can never always exclude fully any major attack from happening again, but I think the chances of that happening are much lower today. Why? I think it's to the credit of our law enforcement that has been very agile in adapting to the evolving threat. And is now still evolving, as I explained, to the kind of new threats that we're seeing. But we have to recognize that the threat has never really disappeared, and it's unlikely to disappear in the short term. Why? Because it's very much driven by propaganda, by conflicts outside of this world, outside of our borders, I should say, that are very much feeding into our public narratives or our public debates, and sometimes affecting also our young people. That's where we are today.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.